one of the things that I had done previously was for Good Friday services or for Christmas services at this huge church of 12,000 people, which had huge Good Friday services, 8 of them over the course of 2 days for 2,000 people per service. My task was to make these short films or vignettes about Jesus. And so going back as far as, 2012, I was doing these little, like it's where I met Jonathan Rumi, who plays Jesus in The Chosen, I was doing a short film about the crucifixion from the perspective of the 2 thieves on the cross. And so this notion of telling the stories that I've heard hundreds of times, but from different perspectives, had already proven itself over the last 5 years to be an extraordinary tool in unlocking people's emotional connection to the story.
Why? What did you see when you were making those films? What sort of impact was that having?
So for example, instead of being just what most Bible projects are, like I assume you've seen, have you seen the Jesus of Nazareth miniseries? Have you seen any of these kind of Jesus movies?
No. The Chosen is the one that I've watched.
Oh, well, good. But the genre of biblical filmmaking, particularly Jesus filmmaking, tends to be verse by verse. It's a reenactment of the verses that you're reading. It's not a story per se that you're telling that follows traditional 3-act structure, other than the fact that a lot of Jesus stories do. But it's, and then Jesus did this, and then Jesus did that, and then he encountered a blind man.
Right. So is it fair to say that that's the subordination of the movie to the text?
Yes. And which makes for sometimes an enjoyable recreation of what you already believe, but certainly not a good movie.
Yeah. And that's a crucial thing. It's a crucial thing. I have a very large collection of Russian propaganda art, like 400 pieces, a lot. And I've studied propaganda a lot. And propaganda is the subversion of art to it's like a subversion of art to an outcome. It's kind of like what we're talking about with regards to your criteria for success. You already know what the target is. The thing about telling a story is a story is a quest.
Yes.
You don't know what the outcome is. Now, you might say, I want to make this story in a way that serves the highest possible purpose. That gives you a lot of degrees of freedom. Right. But the story isn't genuine. The story isn't genuine like a conversation isn't genuine if you know what the outcome's going to be. Like our conversation here, I don't know where it's going to go, right? I want to let it go where it's going to go. The religious films can be propagandistic, just like political films.
Can be. They almost always
are.
are.
I know, and then they fail. They're not interesting.
Yeah.
And I think not only do they not serve the religious purpose, then I think they harm it.
100%.
Because it looks like it's the hijacking of the quest in art to push forward a message that's predetermined. It's not an exploration. There's not even any faith in it, right? Because there's no risk in a way.
Right.
Yeah, so it doesn't work. And, part of the reason I think that one of the things I've learned about atheists, because I've learned a lot about atheists discussing religious issues with atheists.
Have you ever been one? Do you think that there's been a time in your life where you would have said, I don't believe there's a God, or have you always been agnostic on the verge of back and forth, wrestling?
I think I was never an atheist because I was never confident enough in my own doubt to proclaim it as a virtue. In a way, I knew it at minimum, I knew that I didn't know what the hell was going on. Right. There's another thing that mitigated against that too, is that I've believed in evil since I was very young.
Which is helpful.
Well,
maybe not when you're 8.
If you believe in evil, you believe in good.
Yes.
Because it's the opposite of evil. Right. So now, amorphous though that may be. Okay, so now, propaganda.
Yeah,
you learned that you were telling stories, and you were doing that by showing these stories from a new light. Okay, so how did you come across that as an idea?
Well, ironically enough, I was listening to a sermon from a pastor in Louisville. His name is Kyle Eidelman. And he did a sermon on the crucifixion, and the story of the crucifixion and Jesus's relationship with the 2 thieves on the cross takes just a few verses.
Right.
So in just a few verses, a man goes from mocking Jesus and seeing those mocking Jesus and joining in on the mockery, and within just a few verses says, I want to be with you. I believe in you.
Right. And a lot of transformation packed into a very short period of time.
As a storyteller, it's pretty bad storytelling. There's no journey. We just know he was mocking him a few verses later. He believed in him. There's no, 3-act structure. I mean, I guess there's the first and the third act. There's the before and the after, but there's no middle. And so what would lead him? This pastor was saying, what might have he heard from Jesus that could have caused him to break, right? And so this pastor opined, not claiming fact, but he opined, what if he was broken by Jesus's comment, "Forgive them, Father, for they know not what they do." Some of this, he's being mocked.
Well, that would be a thing to be broken by if you actually saw it happen.
Right. So you're mocking him, you're joining in the mockery, and he's just completely, not only is he not fazed and broken by it, he's actually praying for the forgiveness of the people who are doing it.
And he means it. Right.
So that's what his opinion was, and I thought that was very compelling, and I thought, I want to make a short film where we unpack the backstory, the before. And that's a word we use all the time on the show.
So there's a lot in that story that needs unpacking too. Right. It's like there's lots of things in principle that you could have taken inspiration from. Why do you think that hit you, what he was doing? Why do you think that captured because that's a calling, right? That's the manifestation of a calling. And it has a big effect, as it turns out. Right. So something is being born there. Something triggers a commitment or an interest. What happens exactly when you see him?
It's a very quick and easy answer. I'm a storyteller. So, just for example, I watch your gospel series on Daily Wire, and I'm seeing extraordinary intellectuals wrestle with and discuss and debate. And I'm watching it, and of course it speaks to me because I love the Gospels and I've been a believer as long as I can remember. And I've been tasked and stewarded with, again, fast forwarded for a second, with portraying the gospel story to the world through the medium of television in this way that has seemingly transcended cultures and boundaries. And so I'm interested in it from that perspective. But I listen to some of you talk and I go, yeah, that's fascinating. But my job and my calling and my interest and my skill set is to tell it as a story. And because I'm a storyteller, I'm attracted to the emotional as much or more than the intellectual. And so I've known these stories all my life, but ever since I was a kid, when I was a little kid, I would hear Sunday school stories. And I'm going, what would it have been like to sit around with Jesus at a campfire? What was it like to be a sibling of Jesus and to argue with him, and then his parents come involved and they always side with Jesus because he's never wrong? What would it have been like to go to school with the perfect Son of God? All those, I was always intrigued by those. And the reaction you just had where you chuckled, I'm like, that was me. I'm going, and I would say that. I'd go, can you imagine what it would have been like to be Jesus's brother? And to go, Mom, Jesus did this again. And Jesus, and his mom says, well, you need to make the adjustment. He's like, you're always on, Jesus can do no wrong. He's the perfect child. Mom's like, well, yes, he is actually.
That's very funny.
So those kinds of things, I was 8 years old and was wrestling with that, right? So well, and there are people who are natural storytellers, but that's a real gift. And well, my father is an author of over 200 books. He's one of the most prolific authors of all time.
So you came by it honestly.
Yes. And so I'm a storyteller in the classroom. I was a storyteller when I wasn't supposed to be. I've always been a storyteller. So when a pastor is unpacking 3 to 4 verses with an intellectual conclusion, the part that speaks most to me is the story part of it. Yeah. What might have been the backstory? I'm like, I'm on the case.
You see with Christ's parables frequently like an amalgam of those two approaches, because he'll tell a story, and then the disciples, for example, will say, well, thank you, but we don't really get it. And then he'll lay out the explanation. I've certainly found in my lectures that the most effective way of driving a point home is to tell a story and to provide an explanation, right? The story is brought, it's like the playoff intellectually between Dostoevsky and Nietzsche, who are aiming in very similar directions. Dostoevsky's stories cover a much broader territory than Nietzsche's thinking, but they're less explicit, right? They're less propositional. So that there's a loss there because it's not as defined. Nietzsche is more defined and more specific, but there's a loss because the expanse that Dostoevsky covers is broad. I'll give you an example. So in the Brothers Karamazov, the hero is a novitiate named Alyosha, and he's contrasted. Alyosha is a very good person, but he's not an intellectual, and his arguments aren't as tightly formulated and pointed as they might be. He's often at a loss for words. His brother Ivan is hyper-charismatic and unbelievably pointed in his propositional reasoning, and if he goes head-to-head with Alyosha, he can win the argument. But he loses the battle because as the story unfolds, you see that the goodness of Alyosha triumphs over the Luciferian rationality of Ivan. Ivan wins all the battles, you might say, but loses the war. And Dostoevsky could portray that because he used a story. Like Nietzsche, as a philosopher, would have to make the philosophical case for Alyosha. That isn't what happens in Dostoevsky. Dostoevsky shows what happens as Alyosha's life unfolds. He does the same thing in his book, The Idiot, which is about a prince who's an analog of Christ, who is a holy fool and who people have some pity for. But he's a very good person, and you see that unfold in the story. Right. Dostoevsky's showing how a life well lived is triumphs over an argument well formulated. That's a good way of thinking about it.
Correct. And I know just enough. I'm a good enough arguer. I'm a good enough at formulating arguments to be dangerous. But at my heart, I always find that the way into the persuasion, if you want to look at it from that way, is storytelling. And it always seems to...
Persuasion or communication?
Both.
Yeah, okay.
So if I say to you right now, so this morning I wake up and I get out of bed, the simple fact of me saying that, you're going, well then what happened?
Right.
Even though you know that it's probably, in most likely, banal, it's not very few significant things happen when you just get out of bed, but you're intrigued, right? That's all I know. I don't know that I can intellectualize why. I just know that it works, and I know that that when I set out to make that short film about the two thieves, we showed their backstory. We showed how they met. We showed, again, all through not fact, but through what we call plausibility. Is it plausible? What would have been in the cultural context, the historical context? So my co-writer, Tyler Thompson, at the time had never written a screenplay in his life, but we were working at the same place, and he's brilliant at connecting the Old Testament to the New. He's brilliant with historical context and cultural context. And so we worked together to fashion a plausible backstory for the two thieves. Jesus doesn't show up until the last 5 minutes of the short film. So we spend 20 minutes establishing the things that led these two thieves to be on the cross. And they finally get on the cross, and we get to the crucifixion moment when Jesus is there. And the audience, of course, in a church is going, all right, now we're here. We get it. This is the crucifixion story we've heard so many times, but we're seeing all these comments from Jesus that are in Scripture. We're seeing them now through the lens of the two thieves on the cross, this backstory that we've been following. And so what happened, to your question, is the audience I saw and experienced, and they told me there was a significant aha moment.
Right. That's a revelatory moment.
I had never considered this. It makes more sense to me now. Now when I read
things go together.
Yes, now when I read these four verses, I actually can not only understand it perhaps a little better, but I also can see myself in the thief on the cross. And that's the problem with most biblical storytelling, is that it's through the eyes of Jesus. Jesus actually doesn't make for a good protagonist in a drama, because he doesn't necessarily, outside of that moment in Scripture where it says he grew in wisdom and stature. But once his ministry starts, he doesn't make for a great protagonist, because he doesn't necessarily learn. He doesn't necessarily go from bad to good or anything like that. And so when we see all these miracles that he's performing and these life change that he's causing, we don't know anything about the people that he's causing it for. If that's a clunky way of saying it, but we don't. How can we unpack the woman who's been bleeding for 12 years and touches the hem of this garment?
Well, so what you're doing, it's analogous, I would say, to, let's say, what the Renaissance artists in particular did when they were painting images from the Bible, right? Sure. They're taking textual reference and they're fleshing them out. Now, it's a static image, although a great Renaissance painting is packed with insanely packed with information. But you have the advantage of being able to do that in 3 dimensions, right? Because you can add that temporal element, so you can use your imagination. See, it's interesting, because this is analogous to what the great psychoanalytic thinkers did in relationship to dream analysis.